Hello and welcome back to the channel that brings you the stories behind the stories. This is NPA Discovery, where we look deeper, think harder, and uncover the real people behind the legends. Today, we're diving into the life of one of the most revolutionary artists in music history, John Lennon. A man whose songs preached peace, but whose personal life was often anything but peaceful. Now, before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep telling stories that matter. Let's talk about Lennon. There's a reason he still commands attention decades after his tragic death. He was a Beatle, a poet, a provocateur, and a deeply flawed human being. And that's the truth. The world has tried to paint him as a saint or a villain, depending on who's telling the story. But the truth is more complex. Lennon was both sinner and visionary. He could be cruel, but he could also be deeply compassionate. He stood for world peace but struggled to make peace with himself. So, is it fair to call John Lennon a man with a terrifying temper? Absolutely. But is that the full story? Not even close. Let's rewind the tape. John Lennon was born on October 9, 1940, in Liverpool, England, during a moment of uneasy calm in World War II. Even his birth was dramatic. His father, Alfred, was a merchant sailor who disappeared for long stretches. His mother, Julia, was charming, spontaneous, and utterly unequipped to raise a child alone. By the time Lennon was 5, his family life had already fallen apart. Alfred left the family without a word. And when he did return, he was greeted by the sight of Julia pregnant with another man's child. What followed was a custody crisis that could rival any soap opera. Young John ended up being raised by his Aunt Mimi, a stern, no-nonsense woman who provided stability but little warmth. In contrast, his visits with Julia were chaotic and unconventional. She was more friend than mother, spinning Elvis records and teaching him banjo instead of baking cookies or enforcing rules. This tension between stability and chaos would become a recurring theme in Lennon's life. But even then, Lennon was already drawn to the unconventional. He had a sharp tongue, a brilliant mind, and a knack for pushing boundaries. It was clear early on that he wasn't going to live a quiet life. Julia once bought John his first guitar but had it delivered to her own house so Mimi wouldn't find out. Mimi, ever the pragmatist, famously quipped, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." The irony, of course, is that guitar changed everything. At the age of 14, Lennon experienced a series of gut-wrenching losses. First, his beloved Uncle George, Mimi's husband and one of his only stable father figures, died suddenly. Then, just a few years later, tragedy struck again. Julia, the mother who never truly mothered, was killed by a car outside Mimi's house. These back-to-back losses created a wound in Lennon that never truly healed. He once said, "I lost her twice. Once when I moved in with Mimi, and again when she died." Rather than break him, though, these tragedies fueled his passion. Lennon poured his anguish into music. He formed a band called the Quarrymen, and soon met Paul McCartney, who introduced him to George Harrison. The rest, as they say, is history. But beneath the soaring melodies and groundbreaking harmonies, Lennon was still raging. He was angry at the world, angry at himself, and that anger often exploded in disturbing ways. One of the most disturbing aspects of Lennon's early years was his temper. He could be violent, especially in his relationships. He once admitted to hitting his then-girlfriend Cynthia Powell in a jealous rage. Later in life, he was open about this dark side, acknowledging his behavior and expressing shame. In an era when male violence was often swept under the rug, Lennon's public confession was startling. But it was also the first step in a long journey toward self-awareness and change. He once said, "I used to be cruel to my woman, and physically, any woman. I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I hit." By the early 1960s, the Beatles were on the verge of global domination. They played marathon sets in the clubs of Hamburg, where Lennon, McCartney, Harrison, and new drummer Pete Best hardened their skills. But it wasn't just about the music. Hamburg was also where Lennon began experimenting heavily with substances, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. When fame finally hit, it hit hard. And Lennon, already a volatile figure, struggled to cope. The screaming fans, the endless touring, the pressures of being on all the time, it all chipped away at him. By 1965, Lennon was increasingly disillusioned with the band that had made him famous. He turned inward, experimenting with psychedelics and exploring Eastern philosophy. The music evolved, but so did the fractures within the band. And then came Yoko Ono. Let's begin with a name that's been tied to John's mythos like no other, Yoko Ono. Depending on who you ask, she was either the woman who freed him or the force that fractured the greatest band in history. The truth, like Lennon himself, is more complicated. When Lennon met Yoko in 1966 at an art gallery in London, it wasn't love at first sight. In fact, it was confusion. Yoko was avant-garde, a performance artist who made viewers cut her clothes on stage to make a statement. But to Lennon, who had grown tired of the rock and roll machine, she was something new. Someone who challenged him intellectually, spiritually, even artistically. That's why, just 2 years later, she wasn't just his muse, she was his partner in every sense. And this partnership didn't come quietly. During the recording of the Beatles' White Album, Lennon broke the band's long-standing rule, no partners in the studio. Yoko Ono was present at nearly every session, giving feedback and never staying silent. Paul McCartney later admitted it was uncomfortable, even disruptive. But Lennon didn't care. He was willing to dismantle everything, including the Beatles, for what he called truth. And dismantle he did. In January 1969, during the filming of the Let It Be sessions, the tensions exploded. George Harrison walked out. Paul and John couldn't even look each other in the eye. It wasn't just creative differences, it was personal, emotional, even philosophical. Lennon was changing, and not everyone was ready to follow him. Now, it's easy to vilify Lennon for this period. The drugs, the distance, the radical ideas, he wasn't the mop-top sweetheart anymore. But maybe that's the point. Lennon wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to become real. And when you look at the lyrics of songs like Revolution or God, you don't see a man clinging to his fame. You see someone tearing it all down to find something honest. But authenticity came at a price. In 1969, amid this chaos, Lennon and Yoko staged their now infamous Bed In for Peace during their honeymoon. Media outlets flocked to their Amsterdam hotel suite, expecting scandal. What they got instead was a man, shirtless, sleepy-eyed, singing about peace. And the world didn't quite know what to make of it. The irony of Lennon's activism is that even as he called for world peace, his internal world was falling apart. He was distancing himself from Cynthia, his first wife, and from his son Julian. He was losing connection with Paul, George, and Ringo. The very relationships that built the Beatles were unraveling while Lennon chased a new identity. Some critics say Yoko manipulated him. Others say she saved him. Maybe both are true. But Lennon made his own choices. And the next one was seismic. In 1970, just after the Beatles officially broke up, Lennon released the raw and gut-wrenching John Lennon / Plastic Ono Band album. It wasn't just a collection of songs, it was a confession. In Mother, he screams about abandonment. In Working Class Hero, he spits on the illusions of class and conformity. And in God, he names every idol he's done believing in, including the Beatles. I don't believe in Beatles, I just believe in me, he sang. It was Lennon's declaration of independence, and maybe his final break with the past. But breaking free didn't mean finding peace. Not yet. By 1973, Lennon's once unshakable bond with Yoko Ono was beginning to splinter. The backlash following the Beatles' breakup had reached a boiling point. Fans blamed Yoko for everything, and the pressure had become unbearable. Desperate for a solution, Yoko made an unexpected move. She encouraged John to take a break from their relationship, and suggested he spend it with their assistant, May Pang. Yes, you heard that right. It sounded bizarre, even for the 70s, but it wasn't a joke. May Pang agreed, and soon she and John flew to Los Angeles. What followed was a period Lennon later dubbed his "lost weekend," though it lasted a full 18 months. During this time, Lennon reconnected with his son Julian. After years of emotional distance, he started to rebuild that relationship. He also reignited his friendship with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, sharing rare moments of joy, laughter, and even a few jam sessions. May Pang herself would later recall how John seemed freer, more affectionate, and more creatively alive than he had been in years. But not everything was golden. Lennon's nights in Los Angeles were drenched in alcohol and clouded by substance use. He partied hard, too hard, with people like Harry Nilsson and Keith Moon. His wild behavior got him banned from the Troubadour Club after heckling a performance by the Smothers Brothers. One night, he was even photographed with a sanitary napkin taped to his forehead. It wasn't just wild, it was embarrassing. The lost weekend was a paradox. It gave Lennon space to heal and reconnect, but it also exposed how deeply fractured he had become. For every heartwarming moment with Julian, there was a reckless night that put his health and reputation on the line. And beneath it all, he was still haunted, by guilt, by fame, and by the longing to find peace. By 1975, the weekend was over. Yoko and John reunited, and soon after, she became pregnant. That same year, on John's 35th birthday, their son Sean was born. And just like that, Lennon did something unthinkable for a man of his stature. He walked away from the spotlight. He stopped recording. He stopped touring. He stayed home. For the next 5 years, John Lennon became a full-time father, baking bread, playing games, and writing songs in private. What we often forget is that Lennon's retreat wasn't defeat. It was a kind of quiet revolution. The man who once screamed for peace was finally living it, even if just within the walls of his home. It was the happiest, and most stable, period of his life. But like many beautiful things in Lennon's story, it wasn't meant to last. After years of silence, domestic life, and quiet contemplation, John Lennon did something that surprised everyone. He came back. And not just with any album, he returned with Double Fantasy, a collaboration with Yoko Ono that symbolized not just their love, but Lennon's reawakening. There's something poetic about a man who once screamed into microphones now singing lullabies. Lennon was no longer trying to tear the world apart, he was trying to make sense of it. And yet, even in his serenity, the world couldn't leave him alone. On December 8, 1980, the dream ended. That morning, Lennon and Ono gave an interview to Rolling Stone and posed for photographer Annie Leibovitz. The iconic image, John curled naked beside Yoko, vulnerable and raw, was meant to redefine how the world saw them. That afternoon, Lennon signed an album for a fan waiting outside the Dakota, his New York City residence. The fan's name was Mark David Chapman. That night, as John and Yoko returned home from the studio, Chapman was still waiting. At 10:50 p.m. as Lennon walked toward his building, Chapman pulled a revolver from his coat and fired 5 shots. 4 struck Lennon in the back and shoulder. He collapsed just inside the lobby. Rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, doctors tried everything, but at 11:15 p.m. they pronounced him dead. He was just 40 years old. The world didn't just lose a musician that night, it lost a truth-teller, a provocateur, a visionary. John Lennon died not in rebellion, not in scandal, but in a moment of peace, returning from a studio session with the woman he loved. The shock was global. Fans wept openly in the streets. Vigils sprang up from Liverpool to Tokyo. Even those who hadn't followed Lennon's every move felt the loss. Because John Lennon wasn't just a Beatle. He was our Beatle. The one who sang of imagining no heaven, no hell, just us, here, now. There's no tying a neat bow around Lennon's story. He was flawed, he was fiery, he was ferocious in his search for meaning. But that's why we still talk about him. He wasn't perfect. He was real. And he gave us the soundtrack to our own becoming. So what do we take from this? Maybe it's that peace isn't found in the noise, but in the silence you choose to embrace. Maybe it's that true revolution starts at home. Or maybe it's just this: live loud, love harder, and never stop asking why. If John Lennon taught us anything, it's that being misunderstood isn't the end of the world, it's the beginning of something worth remembering. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, share it. If it made you feel something, comment below. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Let's keep the spirit of truth, rebellion, and raw humanity alive. We'll see you in the next video.